Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I am the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. And my guest today is Diana Greene Foster. Professor Foster is the Director of Research at the Advancing New Standards in Reproductive Health Collaborative Research Group at the University of California, San Francisco. She's also the author of the book, The Turnaway Study, 10 Years, 1,000 Women, and the Consequences of Having or Being Denied an Abortion. It's a remarkable book, a remarkable piece of research that adds information to the abortion debate by looking at the lives of people who were either given abortions or denied abortions, and following, as the subtitle says, 1,000 women over a long period of time. The New Yorker calls it a remarkable piece of research, and Gloria Steinem said that if you only read one book about democracy, the Turnaway Study should be it. It's available now from Scribner. Diana Greene Foster, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so I want to start with the research question that that you were aiming to address here. It seems like a lot of the abortion conversation, the debate centers on philosophy about the moral status of the fetus. And you, as I understand it, thought there was a sort of a big missing piece of information that was necessary to having a sensible discussion about what abortion actually means. So maybe you could lay out where you started, what you thought we sort of needed to understand before you began conducting this giant research project.
Yeah, so the Turnaway Study was started with the hope of answering the question, does abortion hurt women? Because this idea that abortion might harm women has been used to restrict access to abortion. And even in 2007, our US Supreme Court outlawed one procedure on the basis that women would come to regret their decision and be depressed. And if you're going to restrict access to abortion on the basis that women would regret it, then you need to know, well, how much are they going to regret not getting an abortion? So the study really needed to be done to look at the consequences of getting an abortion versus being denied an abortion. And so we looked at mental health and physical health and socioeconomic well-being and life aspirations, a whole slew of outcomes that we thought would be changed by either getting a desired abortion or carrying an unwanted pregnancy to term.
Because a lot of this before the study, as I understand it, was sort of speculative, right? You lay out in the book the kind of hypotheses that one might have about the effects of abortion. There are reasons why one could think that it would affect mental health one way or the other. But we just didn't really have much reliable data, so that people's preconceptions about what an abortion would mean ended up kind of governing the discussion.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. No matter what side you're on, you think there's an effect, and we really needed to take no sides and measure this empirically.
And I guess I just want to ask you about social science for people who are thinking. One of the things that comes across in the book is your desire to come up with something reliable and find a kind of natural experiment that would yield results that can actually mean something. So perhaps you could talk about how, as a social scientist, you went about constructing a piece of research that you thought could really yield conclusions that were helpful.
Yeah, it is a trick with what an ideal study. We would randomize people to either getting an abortion or having a baby. And not only that, we'd blind them so they wouldn't know which happened to them. And obviously that's not ethical and it's
not
ridiculous.
Yes.
So that can't happen. So how can we get as close as possible to randomizing people? And what we did was we went to 30 abortion facilities across the United States, where if you're too late for an abortion there, no one else nearby can do an abortion later. And we recruited people on either side of those gestational limits. So people who are just over the limit, just under the limit. And what you really want in randomizing people is to have the two groups the same. You
Hmm.
want the two groups the same at the onset and then to study their differences over time. And that's exactly what this study achieved. The two groups were nearly identical in terms of motivations for abortion, baseline physical health, baseline mental health. One group, the group denied, was a little bit younger, and that's because women who are younger are a little slower to recognize they're pregnant, and it's that
Mm.
extra week
Mm.
that might make the difference in being denied. But we controlled for age in these analyses, and we followed the both groups over time and found that, in fact, in many ways, their outcomes did diverge over time.
Now, I mean, I think one of the important aspects of this book is that your findings are, as you say, they are useful to the conversation no matter where one stands. You approach this as a research scientist. We are speaking in sort of unemotional terms, but I do just want to dwell on this fact that some women seeking abortions are turned away and some get them because you discuss in the book the fact that, I mean, I think one of the values of the book is it forces us to empathize. It forces us to understand what is actually going on the ground and the things people are going through. And so perhaps we could discuss some of the factors that do and what it's like for people who either get or don't get. I mean, you talk about, for example, those who are struggling to put the money together. For instance, they are told they're running against the clock essentially to get an abortion and amass the enough money to pay for the procedure.
Yeah, too often the abortion debate is abstract. It's like philosophical rights of a fetus versus a woman, and not even discussing why a person would want to have an abortion and what it takes to get one. And that allows people to think, oh, it's an easy decision that people make half-heartedly and then come to regret. When the reality
Mm.
is that it's very difficult to get an abortion. Often just gathering the money to pay for it slows people down. We have laws that intentionally slow people down, for example, waiting periods, but ones that
Mm.
unintentionally slowing people down by like forbidding insurance companies from paying for the procedure or federal government from paying for the procedure or other laws which shutter clinics and make people travel farther. So we've made it as difficult as possible to get an abortion, and then not surprisingly, some people who want it can't get it. Right now in the United States, the Supreme Court's considering whether to let Texas continue to ban
Mm.
abortion at 6 weeks, which has resulted in a 50% drop in abortions in that state. So there's no question that it's very difficult to access abortion in parts of the country.
Well, I just interviewed your University of San Francisco colleague Carol Joffe a couple of weeks ago, and about her co-authored book Obstacle Course. So we did talk about a lot of these
Yes.
barriers, and so I do want to focus on what you then add, which is what happens after someone is turned away or not. But no, just talking about the sort of lead up to the abortion procedure or to being turned away, I do want to ask. So why? What are the typical reasons? What are the breakdowns of reasons for why people do end up over the line and being turned away usually?
So if you ask people what slowed them down, they say raising money to pay for the procedure slowed them
Mm.
down. But if you look statistically at the people who were early versus late, a very large fraction of the difference is not realizing you're pregnant. So if
Mm.
you're late to realize you're pregnant, then you have to gather more money, you have to travel farther, it takes longer to find a clinic that will do the abortion. So all of the logistical barriers snowball. And you could
Mm.
wonder, well, how is it possible someone wouldn't know they were pregnant? It happens when people don't have pregnancy symptoms. It happens when they're young and never have been pregnant before. And it happens when people were using contraception to prevent pregnancy, which 2/3 of the women in the study were doing. And if you think you're protected, then you're slower to realize that, in fact, that
Yeah.
you failed or the contraceptive failed and you are indeed pregnant.
There is an absolutely remarkable chart in the book that I think was kind of a revelation to me, where you talk about where it lists the different forms of contraception and how many times you would have to use them in
Yes.
order to not get pregnant over the course of your sexually active life,
Here.
right?
Yes.
And and it's a lot. I mean, the regularity, the discipline of using contraception, if at no point you want to have an unintended pregnancy, is quite intensive.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think it's unappreciated that people that it takes a lot to prevent pregnancy. I estimate you would need, over 2,000 condoms, over 7,000, almost 7,000 oral contraceptive pills, almost 1,000 contraceptive patches. And that all these little calculations assume that you've got constant access to health insurance and providers, and you never, run out of supplies before another pack comes, that you're just a consistent user. And for many people, that is not the case. Additionally, in addition to having to have access, you have to actually like this method to use it consistently over one's lifetime. And lots of people don't find methods that work for them, that don't cause side effects, that are easy to use, that respect their desire for control over the method or privacy, or desire not to have to go to a clinic all the time. So it's really not easy. We don't have perfect methods of birth control yet.
Yeah, one of the things that I think that another statistic that you cite in the book is that women are not pleased with the availability of the existing methods of birth control. I mean, it's highly imperfect, right? I mean, there's
Yes.
a lot of things that cause side effects. And I do feel like it's a conversation we don't have enough in this country about contraceptive access. We do talk, even those of us concerned with reproductive rights, talk a lot about abortion access. But we kind of assume that contraceptives are widely available, which is kind of true. But there is a long way to go.
Yeah, I think they're legally, they look good, and then practically they don't. For example, I did the research that showed if you give people a 1-year supply of a method, they're less likely to become pregnant, less likely to have an abortion. And so in response, many states changed their law to allow a 1-year supply. And as far as researchers can tell, nobody's getting the benefit of that. It's like
Huh.
less than a fraction of 1% are actually benefiting from a law that looks good on paper, but just isn't being implemented. So there are lots of steps, and they're not all being taken.
Why is that? Why wouldn't they?
Because it requires huge shifts of bureaucracy, and that's always slow. I don't even think there's anyone who's particularly opposed to it, but to get all the pharmacists to change, the insurance companies to change, the doctors to know they can prescribe, it's a lot of shifting that doesn't happen quickly.
Yeah. So let's get to this question of who. I discussed with Professor Jaffe some things about the demographics of who has abortions, the fact that a lot of people already have children, the fact that there's a lot of women of color, the fact that there's a lot of poor women. I want to ask you about attitudes to abortion. Are people who seek abortions conflicted about abortion? How do they? I mean, obviously, there's nothing typical. But what are some of the findings you had about people's attitudes going into the procedure?
I think we have so stigmatized abortion that people can think that abortion is wrong in general and know that in their own circumstance that it was the right thing to do. And so you can be opposed to abortion at some level, but make exceptions for the circumstances that you find yourself in. And so that happens somewhat. Mostly people are supportive of the right to abortion. About 20% said that they thought abortion was morally wrong, but nearly all thought it should be legal. So, requires some nuance to think to understand that your own situation, that other people should receive the similar amount of compassion as you feel towards yourself when you're facing an unwanted pregnancy.
And the situations that people do face that cause them to seek abortions, the as I understand it, the plurality cite economic factors, the financial difficulty of raising a child, but there are a lot of different explanations that people give for why they need an abortion at this point in their life.
Yeah, so we asked people, what are some of the reasons you're wanting to end this pregnancy? And we didn't give them a list of acceptable reasons that they could check off from. We just asked it open ended, and then people gave us many reasons, and we went and categorized it and found that our answers strongly reflect the same answers given on national surveys about this topic. So, mostly financial. That's the most common, with about 40% of people saying. Some people say it's not the right time or circumstances to have a child or another child. People give partner related reasons, including that the partner's abusive, the partner wouldn't be a good father, the relationship isn't strong enough. About, as you alluded, about many people say they want to focus on taking care of the children they already have. So people give a range of reasons, and these reasons. What's super interesting about the reasons people give is that when you ask a woman who's seeking an abortion why they don't want to have a baby, the reasons they give are strongly predict the results for the people who are denied. So you say you can't afford to have a baby, and we see in the people who are denied that they become poorer. They say that the relationship with the man involved in the pregnancy isn't strong enough, and we see that those relationships dissolve regardless of whether they have the baby or have an abortion. They say, I want to take care of the children I already have, and we see that their existing children do worse, both in terms of having enough money to pay for their food and housing, but also in their attainment of developmental milestones. So people are thoughtful when they're trying to decide what to do with an unwanted pregnancy. In fact, deciding whether that pregnancy is unwanted, they're weighing all of their aspirations, their responsibilities, and trying to decide what's right. And in fact, their decision making is so astute that they strongly predict the results that we find in this study.
Wow. I feel as if the partner related factors are often not discussed enough. I think there is an assumption that about the I think we do, I think there is some discussion about the economic factors, but the fact that and it's not just abusive situations. It's also the fact that if you go through with a pregnancy, you are essentially obviously you're not committing to stay with a person for the next 18 years of your life, but it does mean that whoever the other parent is going to sort of be in your life in some capacity for a very long time, potentially, if you want this child to have. I mean, it is going to be almost impossible to sever relations with them entirely, and the kind of thing that someone is signing up for when they sign up to have a child is just an immense change in people's lives in so many ways.
Yeah, so that's your guess is right. Maybe it wasn't a guess since you've read the book, but in fact, we find that when people that relationships with the man involved in the pregnancy aren't actually more likely to continue. The chance that you're in a romantic relationship with the man involved doesn't change between the women who receive an abortion or are denied. But what does change is what you mentioned, which is ongoing contact with him. So a woman is continues to be exposed to the man involved in the pregnancy, and we see that actually in rates of domestic violence, which plummet for people who receive their abortions and are level for people who are denied. And the difference there is that one group, the one who got the abortion, are able to extricate themselves from unhealthy relationships, and the people who carry that pregnancy to term continue to be exposed to that man. It doesn't make the romantic relationship last, but it does result in ongoing contact.
I really do feel as if that is completely left out of the conversation a lot. You know, there's this phrase abortion except in the cases of rape or incest, and as if these are the only cases in which we could be talking about some kind of abusive situation. I mean, what you're identifying here is that to force a woman to go through with a pregnancy is often to keep, even if the pregnancy is the result of a consensual sexual encounter, is to potentially force someone to maintain contact with an abusive partner for potentially years.
Yeah, and that isn't the majority
Right,
experience, but it happens. And I
right.
think it's the reason why externally it's hard to say what the acceptable reasons for abortion are. Because,
Mm,
yes, this one pregnancy wasn't rape or incest, but yes, it also involved continuing abuse. And so, oh, but we didn't make an exception for them. And then there are other people who have other reasons, and they're raising a child without enough money to pay for food and housing
mhm.
is not a good outcome. That do we make exceptions for that? And what about a woman with pre-existing health conditions where she feels like she's not physically strong enough to go through with pregnancy? Maybe we should make an exception for that. And I don't know how to make a list of only the acceptable reasons. And what this
Mm.
study shows is that people have their reasons and they're right. And so we don't have to decide for them what the good reasons are.
Well, I take it that is what is underlying what Gloria Steinem said about the book, its relationship to democracy. I think that's a really interesting word to invoke in a study about abortion rights, or a study about abortion, because what we really are talking about is who makes a particular decision, who is competent to make it, and is that the person who is most affected by it, or is that a legislature? And I think what you identify is that the way people make this decision is really quite sophisticated and accurate.
Yeah, it's a super personal decision, and I don't think it would be possible for someone else to make that decision for her,
Mm.
um, and take into account all of the factors that people are weighing when they're trying to make this decision.
So, one of the central contributions of the study is that it follows women over time after they were either had the procedure or were turned away. And one of your headline findings here is that this idea that is constantly pushed of abortion regret really is a minor exception, and for the most part, as I understand it, women who are granted the procedure really do feel as if it was the correct choice for them.
Yeah, it's our most famous statistic is that over 95% of people who receive their abortion feel like it was the right decision over time. And that actually trends up towards 99% by the end of the 5 years that we followed people.
Hmm.
And if you ask who feels like it wasn't the right decision, it's
Right.
people who said that it was an extremely difficult decision at the onset. So that's not surprising. That's just people who had a hard time deciding are slightly more likely to question their decision later. But in fact, even among that group who says it was hard, they trend towards saying it was the right decision over time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of people they just don't understand how complicated people's lives are and how much else goes on. So people who received their abortions did a lot over the 5 years. They got different jobs, they finished school, they sometimes had other children. And so their life isn't spent just dwelling on this unwanted pregnancy that happened 5 years ago.
Hmm.
One woman said to us, the only time I think about it is when you call me for these interviews.
Yeah, yeah. So it isn't necessarily something that people dwell too much. But one of the kind of interesting findings, that tell me if I'm stating this correctly, is that those who are turned away, those who are forced to follow through with the pregnancy, they they do have the, as you mentioned, the life outcomes that they predicted they would have, because those factors are quite real. But it is also the case that over time they do feel, is it that they feel that they are glad they went through with the pregnancy, or they what is their attitude towards it over time?
So we asked, just like we asked people who had an abortion whether that was the right decision, we asked the people who were denied the abortion whether they still wish they could have had the abortion. And 1 week later, 65% of them still wish they could have an abortion. It's about more than 1 in 10, but who said it after the child was already born, and that goes down to about 4% by the 5 years. And who is particularly likely to say, I still wish I could have had an abortion, are the people who placed the child for adoption. So very few people chose to place the child for adoption. And those who did were more likely to say that they still wish they could have had the abortion. So it's one thing to say, I still, it's, if you're raising a child, it's a little bit hard to come to say, I wish I could have had an abortion.
Right.
Some people do say
That's
that.
understood.
Most people are resilient. They are caring for that child. They're being the best parents they can be. And one thing that we ask people is about their emotional connection to the child. So we ask a British scale called the Postpartum Bonding Questionnaire. It's 12 items about how you feel about your child. Things like, my baby is the most beautiful baby in the world, or my baby stresses me out. They're on both sides. And we ask both groups, those who were denied an abortion and had carried that pregnancy to term, versus the women who got their abortion and chose to carry a subsequent pregnancy to term within the 5 years. And so really this difference in these two sets of kids is there an emotional benefit to being able to control the timing of your births? And we see that the women who got their wanted abortions, had pregnancies under better circumstances later, actually showed better bonding with that child than the women did who were denied an abortion. And just to not give the wrong impression, it's not that everyone who was denied an abortion didn't bond with the child. It's just that the chance of poor bonding was greater for those unwanted pregnancies than when women had control over the outcomes of their pregnancies.
Yeah, so people who do not have abortions do kind of, I mean, it seems like both groups kind of come to terms with life as it turned out. Which I guess is consistent with what we know about human beings, which is that whatever happens to us, right? To live in regret is something that we try not to do. But when you started to look kind of objectively at this group of women who were turned away, you did in fact find that it would have, on a number of indicators, been better for them if they had been able to have a pregnancy under circumstances of their choosing.
Yes, exactly. This study is like, by recruiting a whole bunch of people at the same point in life, they're having an unwanted pregnancy. Some received the abortion, some don't. It's like getting to look at the road that wasn't taken by analyzing the data for so many people, knowing that the two groups were the same at the onset. And we find a couple major areas where the women who are denied abortions are worse off. One is in their physical health, and this is consistent with the medical literature that carrying a pregnancy to term and giving birth is much more physically risky than having an abortion, even abortion in the second trimester, first trimester or second trimester. And the other is in socioeconomic well-being. So people say, I can't afford to have a child. And when they're denied an abortion, they're much more likely to live below the federal poverty level than if they had received an abortion. And that's because full-time employment drops. Although public assistance increases, it's just not enough to make up for the loss of employment. And I actually have a quote from a woman in the study. There was a woman who was denied an abortion, and she uh, carried the pregnancy to term, and then she couldn't raise the child because her life was just chaos. And she had a lot of domestic violence in her home. And she said to us, and so her mother stepped in and adopted the child because she just couldn't care for the child. But after trying to raise the child for a year and what she said to us was that it's very, very difficult to find a job when you're pregnant, to keep a job when you're pregnant, and to find and maintain a job with a baby, especially if your partner doesn't want to help. So domestic violence skyrockets because you're financially dependent on your partner because you have to be home with the kid. Pregnancy is an
Mm,
incredibly scary thing if you cannot trust the person you're with.
mm, mm. And yeah, right. And people may have fewer options in their choice of partner as well. So that initial question you set out to answer, does abortion hurt women? It is not only that the answer to that question is no, because if we look at least the subjective experience of women who have abortions, they do feel as if it was right for them. But it is not just that, but the other question, does not having an abortion, despite desiring to have an abortion, does that hurt women? And the answer to that question is yes, in fact, it does.
Yeah, so we looked at one more aspect of does abortion harm women, which is looking at their mental health over time. And we find that depression is somewhat elevated at the time of seeking an abortion and goes down over time. Likewise, it does so with the people who are denied. There isn't a difference in depression. Um, and so there is no evidence in terms of post traumatic stress, suicidality, anxiety, depression that getting an abortion hurts women. Their outcomes improve over time. But those who are denied have elevated anxiety, lower self esteem, lower life satisfaction at the onset. And this is during the time when they're acclimating to the news that they're going to have a baby that they weren't ready for. Over time, their mental health findings actually look like the people who got the abortion. The story, in terms of the difference between the groups, is not in mental health.
Mm,
Mental health wise, people are resilient.
mm,
Instead, the big differences are in physical health and socioeconomic well being. And then one other area that we didn't touch on yet, which is people's life aspirations, the goals
mm,
they're setting for themselves.
mm.
And there we see that people who are denied an abortion are just less likely to set aspirational plans for the future and less likely to achieve them. And this is because they're scaling back what they can do because they realize that they're going to be caring for a child that they probably weren't ready for. And the life aspirations also includes people denied an abortion are less likely to have an intended pregnancy later. So it's the fact of this pregnancy carried to
Mm.
term makes it less likely that they'll be in a high quality relationship and have a child under better circumstances later.
Right. Because when people give in that initial answer to why are you having an abortion, when they say, I'm not ready, um, I take it what that can often mean is I would like to finish school first, or I would like to advance to some certain point in my career so that I can, plan
Yeah.
my pregnancy. Do people who have abortions tend to have planned pregnancies later?
Yeah, the rate is something about 7% per year have an intended pregnancy later if
Mm,
they receive that abortion, and something like 2% if they were denied. So
mm,
over each year, that's a pretty big difference. And
right.
so it can't be said that, um, you know, making someone carry an unwanted pregnancy to term is pro baby, because in fact, it may result in
Right.
fewer intended babies later.
Yeah. Right. Right. Because there's all this panic over the declining birth rate in the United States, and how we want more babies. So if we get to the kind of the finally to the implications of this for the abortion policy debate. I take it one of the major ones is probably that regardless of our conversation on the moral status of the fetus philosophically, I take it we have to understand that when we are talking about the question of criminalizing or legalizing abortion, when we're talking about the level of access to abortion, when we're talking about the obstacle course that Professor Joffe talked about that is thrown in the path of people seeking abortions, we really are discussing either choosing to make people's lives objectively better according to themselves or impose a significant cost on them in many ways.
Yeah, I think the focus on just maternal rights versus fetal rights is missing a bigger picture, that it's not a philosophical debate alone, though you can have your own viewpoint on that, but that there are many people involved. The child that could be born from that pregnancy, the woman's existing children, the future children, her partner, and it's just more complicated. And I think rather than abstraction and moralizing, we need a little bit of stand back and look at the actual impacts on people's lives.
Well, and I think people really ought to. I've enjoyed this conversation with you tremendously, but I think people really need to open up the book, right? Because in the book you have what's nice about it is you have a lot of first-person testimonies from people in their own voices, so that people can actually understand, what we are really talking about when we're having this debate, which is we're talking about what happens in the lives of actually existing human beings who will either go down one path or the other.
Yeah, I am very quantitative. I love to have ask the same measure of a whole group of women and compare the statistics, and that's normally how I approach things. But I knew that data alone is not the whole picture here, and that we needed to talk to people and hear from them in their own words what the experience was like, and to understand their circumstances, how they view them, and what unfolded over time. So the book profiles 10 women. We've randomly selected them, and they're from the study. They're people who participated in the study, who had done their quantitative interviews. And then we called them, and my colleague Heather Gould asked them some very general questions like, what were you thinking at the time you were making this decision? What happened next? And these narratives unfolded that just show you that there's just a huge range of people. They're people they're like people we all know, from being disorganized to organized to, focused on their careers to focused on their families. And it does humanize the experience, I think.
Well, Diana Greene Foster, thank you so much for joining me. Professor Foster is the author of the Turnaway Study, 10 Years, 1,000 Women, and the Consequences of Having or Being Denied an Abortion, available now from Scribner. It's worth mentioning that though you are the author of the book, the research project is a sort of mammoth research project that had quite an impressive team behind it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nathan.